K9, German Shepherd raised abandoned wolf pups, but 1 year later, something unbelievable happened. The wild is ruthless. Only the strongest survive. But sometimes, fate brings together the most unlikely souls, forming a bond that defies nature itself. In the depths of a remote wilderness, far from human civilization, a canine German Shepherd named Thor found himself alone after losing his handler. Once a loyal and disciplined police dog, he was now just another creature fighting to survive. But his life took an unexpected turn when he stumbled upon 3 abandoned wolf pups, weak and starving, their mother nowhere in sight. Instinct told him to walk away. Wolves were not his kind. They were wild, untamed, destined for a different life. But something inside him, something deeper than training, something older than instinct, made him stay. That night, as the pups shivered against his warm fur, a connection was born. A new pack, one that should have never existed. For a year, Thor raised them, protected them, taught them how to survive. But the wild always calls back its own. One day, the wolves disappeared into the forest, leaving him behind. Thor thought that was the end of their story, until something unbelievable happened. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss an incredible story like this one. What happens next will leave you speechless. Now, let's get started. The forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant howls. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and hidden dangers, but Thor, the canine German Shepherd, moved through the wilderness with silent precision. His instincts had always guided him, first as a police search and rescue dog, and now as a lone survivor in the unforgiving wild. Thor had once belonged to a handler, a man whose voice had been his command, whose presence had been his purpose. But that life was gone. A tragic accident had left him stranded in the depths of the wilderness, far from civilization. He had waited at first, believing his handler would return for him. But days turned into weeks, and the realization settled in. He was alone. Now, every day was a battle for survival. The structured world of commands and training had been replaced with the raw, instinct-driven fight for food, water, and shelter. He had learned to listen, to the rustle of prey in the underbrush, to the distant growls of predators. He had learned to hunt, tracking small animals and feeding off the land. But nothing had prepared him for what he found that day. Thor's ears twitched at the faintest sound, a high-pitched whimper carried by the wind. He froze, listening. It was weak, almost ghostly, but unmistakable, a cry for help. He followed the sound, weaving through the thick trees, stepping carefully over fallen branches. As he approached a clearing, his sharp eyes caught movement. 3 tiny wolf pups lay curled together in the dirt, trembling. Thor hesitated, his instincts warring against each other. He had been trained to rescue, to protect. But these were wolves. Wild, dangerous creatures that would one day grow into powerful predators. He should leave them. It wasn't his place to interfere. And yet, they were alone, helpless. Their fur was thin, their ribs visible beneath their fragile frames. They wouldn't survive the night. Thor took a cautious step forward, lowering his head to sniff them. They smelled of fear, of abandonment. They smelled like something he knew too well. He circled them, testing their reaction. One of the pups, smaller than the others, lifted its head weakly and let out a soft whimper. It didn't try to run. It was too weak. Thor laid down beside them, his large body curling slightly around their tiny forms. The smallest one pressed against him first, instinctively seeking warmth. The other 2 followed, hesitating only for a moment, before nestling into his fur. Thor stayed there, still as stone, feeling their small bodies tremble against him. This wasn't instinct. This was something else. That night, as the wind howled through the trees and the temperature dropped, Thor became their protector. The days passed in a blur of survival and adaptation. Thor hunted, bringing back food for the pups, who were still too weak to fend for themselves. At first, they didn't understand. They were afraid, unused to the presence of a dog so unlike their own kind. But hunger overcame fear. They followed him, watching how he moved, learning from him. Thor taught them the essentials: how to track scents, how to stay hidden from danger, how to survive. He showed them how to move silently, how to drink from the streams without attracting predators. And slowly, the bond between them deepened. The smallest pup, the one who had first pressed against him that night, became the closest to Thor. He would follow him wherever he went, mimicking his movements, seeing Thor as something more than a protector. As time passed, the pups grew stronger. Their bodies filled out, their movements became sharper. They weren't helpless anymore. But Thor knew the truth. They were wolves. And one day, they would leave. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, painting the sky in hues of gold and red, Thor led the young wolves to a hilltop. From there, the vast wilderness stretched endlessly before them, a world they had yet to fully explore. They sat in silence, the cool breeze ruffling their fur. The smallest pup, now stronger, nudged Thor's side playfully before settling beside him. Thor listened to the wind, his ears twitching at the faint sheen of distant howls. A pack. His body tensed. The wolves lifted their heads, ears perked, sensing it too. Something stirred in their golden eyes. An instinct. A calling. Thor exhaled slowly, the realization settling in. They were not meant to stay. And soon, they would understand that too. He closed his eyes, allowing himself a rare moment of peace. For now, they were still his, but the wild was calling. And when it did, they would have to answer. The forest had become their home, their training ground, their sanctuary. Thor had raised the young wolves as if they were his own, teaching them the ways of survival. But deep down, he always knew this day would come. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Thor led the young wolves through a familiar trail, their padded paws silent against the forest floor. They had grown strong. No longer helpless pups, but young predators, sleek and agile. Their golden eyes gleamed with intelligence. Their muscles coiled with newfound strength. They were not the frail creatures he had once shielded from the cold. They were wolves now. The smallest one, the one who had always stayed closest to Thor, trotted beside him, brushing his fur lightly as if seeking reassurance. Thor gave a low, comforting rumble in response, but something inside him felt different today. Something was about to change. As they reached the edge of a vast open valley, the young wolves suddenly stopped, their ears perked up, their noses twitching. Then Thor heard it too. A howl, distant yet powerful, ancient. It echoed through the trees, weaving its way through the wind like a call from the past. A second howl followed, then a third. Thor stiffened, a pack. The young wolves lifted their heads toward the sound, their golden eyes widening in recognition. Their bodies tensed, as if something deep within them had awakened. Thor felt his chest tighten. He had always known this moment would come, but standing there, watching them react, it hurt more than he expected. The smallest wolf took a step forward, then another. Thor let out a low bark, a signal for them to stay close. For a moment they hesitated. They turned back, looking at him, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. Then the howls came again. Louder, closer. Something inside the young wolves answered. Their instincts overpowered everything else. And just like that, they were gone. They ran toward the sound, their bodies sleek and powerful, disappearing into the thick shadows of the forest. Thor watched them go, his heart pounding. He wanted to chase after them, to call them back, to remind them that he was their protector. But they were not his to keep. They never had been. He was alone again. The days passed slowly. Thor roamed the familiar trails, his ears perking up at every distant sound, hoping, foolishly, that they would return, but they never did. At night, he lay curled beneath the trees, listening. Sometimes he heard howls in the distance, but they weren't calling for him. They were calling to each other. His pack. No. Their pack. The forest felt emptier now, the air colder. Thor had spent so long caring for them that he had forgotten what it was like to be alone. He thought he had been preparing them for the wild, but maybe, all this time, he had been preparing himself to lose them. One evening, as the sun cast long shadows over the trees, Thor found himself returning to the valley where he had last seen them. The wind carried the faintest scent of wolves, but it was distant, fading. Thor lay down on the cool earth, his golden eyes fixed on the horizon. He had done his job. He had given them a chance at survival. But why did it feel like he had lost something he could never get back? He let out a slow breath, the weight of solitude pressing down on him. Then, from somewhere deep in the forest, a gunshot. Thor's body snapped to attention. His ears perked, his muscles coiling. Then another gunshot, then a third. His blood ran cold. This wasn't a storm, or a falling tree, or the distant sound of a hunter shooting at nothing. This was close, too close. Thor's instincts roared back to life. He took off in the direction of the sound, his paws hitting the earth in a blur. He wasn't just running, he was hunting. Something was wrong. And deep inside, he knew exactly who was in danger. Thor raced through the forest, his heart pounding with every step. The gunshots had shattered the silence of the wilderness, and now a new scent filled the air. Smoke, metal, blood. His instincts screamed danger, but he didn't slow down. He couldn't. Something was wrong. And deep inside, he knew exactly who was in trouble. As he pushed through the thick underbrush, the familiar scent hit him like a punch to the chest. The wolves. But something was off. Their scent was mixed with another, the acrid stench of humans. Hunters. Thor's pace quickened. His golden eyes scanned the terrain, his ears twitching for any sound. Then, as he reached a small clearing, he saw them. The wolves. His wolves, see. But they weren't running free. They were trapped. 3 large metal cages were set up in the clearing, each containing one of the young wolves. Their fur was bristling, their golden eyes wide with fear as they paced frantically, slamming their bodies against the bars. They were trying to escape, but there was no way out. Thor growled low in his throat, his body coiled with tension. His wolves had been captured, and standing near the cages, loading rifles, were 2 men. Hunters. Thor's eyes locked onto them, his mind sharpening with years of training. He had faced criminals before. He had been a police dog, trained for the toughest situations. But this was different. This wasn't a mission. This wasn't about commands. This was his family. One of the hunters chuckled, kicking the side of a cage. The smallest wolf yelped, pressing itself against the back of the bars. "This one's barely full-grown," the man muttered. "They'll fetch a good price, though. Live wolves are hard to come by." The other man grinned. "Yeah, well, let's make sure they don't get any stupid ideas." Tranquilizers ready. Thor didn't wait. He attacked. With a powerful leap, he lunged from the shadows, his jaws locking onto the nearest man's arm. The hunter screamed, stumbling back as Thor yanked with all his strength. The gun fell to the ground. The second hunter cursed, reaching for his rifle, but Thor was faster. He spun, knocking the man off his feet with a brutal strike of his body. The wolves inside the cages howled, clawing at the bars, their instincts screaming at them to fight. Thor turned, his lips curled back in a snarl. He was outnumbered, but he didn't care. He would fight until his last breath. One of the hunters managed to scramble back to his feet, grabbing a long metal rod. He swung it hard. Thor barely dodged in time. The impact sent dirt flying, and Thor snarled, circling him, waiting for an opening. The other man was still clutching his bleeding arm, reaching for something inside his jacket. A gun. Thor's heart pounded. He needed to finish this, fast. The wolves were still trapped, helpless behind the bars. He couldn't let them get hurt. With a burst of speed, Thor lunged again, slamming his body into the injured hunter, knocking him down. The gun skidded across the ground, out of reach. The second hunter, realizing the fight was turning against them, staggered back, grabbing a large net from the supplies nearby. "Stupid dog," he hissed. You wanna die for them?" Thor growled, his fur bristling, his muscles tensed. Then, before he could react, the net flew over him. Heavy, tangled, restricting. Thor thrashed, biting at the thick rope, but the hunter moved quickly, tightening it around him. "Gotcha," the man sneered. Thor struggled, his breath coming in sharp bursts, but the more he fought, the tighter the net became. His legs were caught. He couldn't move. And then, a gun cocked. The injured hunter, blood dripping from his arm, had finally reached his weapon. He pointed it straight at Thor. "End of the line, mutt." Thor stilled, his body heaving, his golden eyes locked onto the barrel. This was it. Then, a snarl. A blur of silver fur. Before the hunter could pull the trigger, something slammed into him. Hard. The smallest wolf, Thor's closest one, his shadow, his packmate, had broken free. The young wolf bit down hard on the hunter's wrist, forcing him to drop the gun. The man screamed, stumbling backward. Thor seized his chance. With every ounce of strength he had left, he tore through the net, snapping it apart with his powerful jaws. He was free, and he wasn't alone. The other wolves were escaping, breaking out of their cages, charging forward in a blur of speed and fury. The hunters panicked. "This isn't worth it," one of them yelled. And just like that, they ran. Thor stood in the middle of the clearing, his body tense, his breath heavy. The hunters were gone. The wolves were free. And yet, something felt wrong. The smallest wolf limped toward him, its fur matted with dirt, its breathing ragged. Thor nudged it gently, scanning its body for injuries. Then, he felt it. A wound. Deep, bleeding. A gunshot. Thor's heart dropped. His wolf, his closest one, the one who had never left his side, had been shot protecting him. Thor pressed his nose against the young wolf's head, letting out a low whimper. The other wolves gathered around, their eyes dark with grief. The battle was over, but the cost had been too high. Thor let out a long, sorrowful howl, and this time, the forest howled back. Thor nudged the young wolf gently, his nose pressing against the pup's trembling body. The wound was deep, too deep. The wolf's breaths were uneven, shallow, its golden eyes flickering with exhaustion. No. Thor let out a soft whimper, his body lowering beside the pup as if shielding it from the world. The other wolves circled around them, their ears flattened, their bodies tense. They knew. The pack had survived the hunters. They had fought together, but now they were losing one of their own. The smallest wolf, the one who had never left Thor's side, the one who had followed him like a shadow, the one who had still smelled like a pup even as it grew strong, had been wounded protecting him. And now, it was slipping away. Thor refused to accept it. He lowered his head, licking the pup's wound gently, trying to clean it, trying to fix it. His own body ached, his muscles screamed from the fight, but none of it mattered. He couldn't let this happen. The pup let out a weak sound, barely more than a whisper of breath. It tried to lift its head, but its body was too heavy, too tired. Thor pressed against it, letting out a low, desperate whine. Stay, stay with me. But deep inside, he knew the truth. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the scent of blood and fading warmth. The night was creeping in, and the pack stood frozen in place, watching. The other wolves, the ones who had found their true kind, didn't understand why Thor wouldn't move. To them, this was nature, life, the way of the wild. But Thor had never been a wolf. He had been a police dog, a protector, a guardian. He had been raised to save lives, to bring others home, to never let go. And now, for the first time, he was powerless. The young wolf let out one last breath, soft, quiet. Then it went still. Thor let out a choked sound, something between a growl and a cry. No, 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 no. He pawed at the motionless body, nudging it, waiting for it to move. Wake up, get up. But it didn't. It never would again. Thor let out a low, mournful howl, a sound of loss, of grief, of a sorrow too deep to bear. The forest stood silent. The trees didn't move. The wind didn't blow. And for the first time since he had been abandoned in this wilderness, Thor felt truly alone. The pack didn't stay. They couldn't. The wolves moved away, disappearing into the trees, their golden eyes glowing for only a moment before they faded into the shadows. Thor stayed behind. He sat beside the fallen pup, his body still, his breathing heavy. He had lost before, his handler, his home. But this was different. This was his pack, his family. And now, the last piece of that family was gone. The weight of it pressed against his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. He wanted to run, to chase after the other wolves, to fight something, anything. But he couldn't move. He couldn't leave, not yet. So he lay there, beside the lifeless body of the one who had once followed him without hesitation. And as the night fell over the wilderness, Thor closed his eyes, listening to the quiet, empty sound of a world that had taken too much from him. The night had settled deep into the forest, wrapping the trees in thick shadows. The world was quiet now, too quiet. No rustling leaves, no distant howls, just silence. Thor remained beside the young wolf's body, his breath slow and heavy. The wolves had left, fading into the wilderness, returning to the life they were meant for. But Thor couldn't move. Not yet. He lay beside the pup, his body curled protectively around it, as if shielding it from the cold. But the cold had already taken hold. The warmth of life had faded. Still, he stayed. The pup had followed him through everything, from the moment Thor had found it shivering, helpless, barely breathing. It had learned from him, hunted with him, trusted him. And now, it was gone. Thor exhaled slowly, pressing his nose against the pup's fur one last time. A silent goodbye. A part of him whispered that he should follow the pack, but his paws felt too heavy. His heart felt heavier. He had failed. A police dog's purpose was to protect, to serve, to bring others home safely. But here in the wild, he had no handler, no commands, no mission. Only instinct, and his instincts had failed him. The stars above flickered through the trees, casting faint silver light onto the forest floor. Thor stared up at them, his golden eyes unreadable. He had always believed in duty, in purpose. But what was left for him now? Nothing. Just an empty space where his pack used to be. Just the ache of loss, sinking deeper into his bones. Dawn came slowly, creeping through the trees with soft golden light. Thor lifted his head. His body was stiff from lying in the same spot all night, but finally, he knew what he had to do. With a deep breath, he pushed himself to his feet. The forest felt heavier than before, but he couldn't stay. Not here, not in this moment. He had to keep moving. With careful, deliberate motions, he began to dig. His paws clawed at the earth, moving the dirt, carving out a place for the fallen pup. It was slow, exhausting. But Thor never stopped. It was the only thing he could do, the only thing left. When it was done, he stepped back, his gaze lingering on the small mound of earth. He had no words, no way to express what this moment meant. So he did the only thing he knew. He tilted his head back and let out a howl, low, deep, mournful. It echoed through the trees, carrying with it every unspoken word, every ounce of grief, every part of him that had been lost. Somewhere in the distance, the wind shifted. A reply never came. Thor lowered his head. Then, with one final glance at the grave, he turned away, and he walked on. The wilderness was vast, endless. The path ahead was uncertain, but there was no turning back. Not anymore. Thor walked through the wilderness, his steps slow, his body heavy with exhaustion. The sun had fully risen, casting long shadows through the towering trees. The air smelled of damp earth and distant water, but Thor barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, back in that clearing, beside the young wolf's lifeless body. The forest felt different now, colder. For so long he had protected them, watched over them, fought for them. Now they were gone, and he was alone, again. His paws carried him forward, but there was no destination. The pack had left him behind, just as he had once been left behind by his human handler. It was the way of things. The wild was unforgiving, but the ache in his chest wouldn't fade. He had trained to be strong, to obey, to endure, but he had never been taught how to let go. Hours passed, maybe longer. Thor moved through the dense trees, drinking from a cold stream, hunting small prey when hunger clawed at his belly. His police training had taught him patience, precision. He still used those skills, even in the wild, but something felt off. A strange scent lingered in the air. Not wolves, not prey. Humans. Thor's body tensed, his ears perking up, his muscles coiled, his instincts sharpening. The hunters. He had chased them away, but he knew their kind. They never truly left. He followed the scent, moving low and silent through the underbrush. The closer he got, the clearer the signs became. Bootprints in the mud, broken branches, a faint trace of gunpowder in the air. Then, voices. Thor stopped, his ears twitching. 2 of them. I saw tracks heading north. A pause? Then another voice, deeper. Think they're still close? A low chuckle. Hope so. A full-grown wolf is worth a fortune. But 2 together, that's a jackpot. Thor's stomach dropped. They weren't talking about just any wolves. They were talking about his pack. A slow, burning rage spread through him. He had already lost one. He wouldn't lose the others. Thor moved fast, following the scent trail the hunters had mentioned. His paws barely made a sound as he sprinted through the trees, his body a blur of motion. He didn't know how far ahead the wolves were, but he knew one thing: they weren't safe. And it was his fault. He had let them go. He had watched them leave, thinking they were strong enough to survive without him. But the world wasn't fair. The wild had its own rules, but humans had their own, and they were far crueler. Thor ran faster. Branches whipped against his fur. The wind roared in his ears. The scent was stronger now. His wolves were close. Then he heard it. A yelp. A sound of pain. Thor's heart clenched. He pushed forward, muscles screaming, lungs burning. And then he saw them. The clearing ahead was a trap. Two young wolves were cornered, their bodies low to the ground, their teeth bared in fear. Their fur was bristling, their golden eyes darting between the hunters in front of them. One of the men raised his rifle. The other was holding Manta snare pole, a thick metal rod with a loop at the end, tightening around the smallest wolf's neck. Thor's vision blurred. The world narrowed to a single thought: attack. With a snarl, he launched himself forward. The hunter with the rifle barely had time to turn before Thor slammed into him, knocking him to the ground. The gun fell from his hands, clattering against the rocks. The second hunter cursed, tightening the snare around the young wolf's throat. The wolf let out a strangled cry, its body thrashing against the restraint. Thor spun, his jaws locking around the metal pole. With a violent shake of his head, he ripped it from the hunter's grip, flinging it aside. The wolves were free, but the fight wasn't over. The hunter on the ground reached for his belt. A knife. Thor didn't hesitate. With a fierce growl, he lunged, knocking the weapon from the man's hands. His jaws snapped shut inches from the hunter's throat, his golden eyes burning with fury. The message was clear. Run. The hunter didn't argue. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing his partner, and they disappeared into the trees. Thor stood still, his breath heavy, his body tense. Then, slowly, he turned to the young wolves. They were panting, their eyes wide with shock. The smallest one, the one who had been trapped, limped toward him, pressing its nose against his chest. A gesture of trust. Thor felt his chest tighten. They had come back. And this time, he wouldn't let them go. He nudged them both gently, checking for injuries. They were shaken, but alive. That was all that mattered. As the adrenaline faded, Thor looked up at the sky. The sun was setting, streaking the horizon with deep reds and golds. The pack was broken, but not lost. And Thor? He was still their protector. No matter what, the forest was quiet again, the danger gone. Thor stood in the clearing, his body aching, his breath still uneven from the fight. But none of that mattered. The young wolves were here, pressed against him, their golden eyes searching his as if to ask, what now? He had spent so long preparing them for the wild, believing they would thrive without him. But the truth was clear now. They had never forgotten him. Even after finding their own kind, even after leaving, they had still needed him. And deep down, Thor realized he had needed them too. The smallest wolf nudged his side, still trembling from the near escape. Thor licked its forehead gently, a silent reassurance. They were safe. They were together. And this time, he wasn't letting go. He turned toward the trees, the fading sunlight casting a warm glow over the land. With a glance back at the young wolves, he took the first step forward. They followed, not as lost pups, not as wild animals, but as family. As the night fell, a long, powerful howl rose into the air. A call, a promise, a story of survival and love that only they could understand. The wolves joined him, their voices blending into the wind. They were no longer just part of the wilderness. They were a pack, and they would always find their way back to each other.